Okay, so we are starting, this is Beowulf. I'm going to scroll to the top just so you can see. And it's a PDF format, so it's a little different than some of the other ones that we've used. It's not an online format, but I like it because it actually you'll notice with the table of contents, it kind of sets up little chapters. And so this is probably the easiest of any version that I have found for you to read. And plus it also kind of gives you a summary. What is this going to be about with this particular section? And then you move to another section and it says what this part's about. Okay. So some of this is going to be a little weird. It's definitely a format that's a little strange for us, but I want to make it even stranger for a second before we go into the easier part. Just so you know, I mean, I actually took a class on Beowulf where that's all we did for an entire semester because what we did, I'm going to go ahead and close the chat out just so you can see this better. And this is actually, it's a bilingual version. So it shows Lo, praise of the prowess of people kings. This is the translation into modern English, but this was originally in Old English. And so I wanted you to see what the Old English looks like. And as you can see, it's very weird. It doesn't really look, there are a lot of letters that are used. So you can see over on the right column, this is the, and I'm going to make it a little bigger, and we're just going to scroll over so you can see what it looks like a little bit bigger. This one is interesting because we have a lot of letters that we used to use in Old English that we don't use anymore. And the reason we don't is actually kind of interesting. It's when we were of course, English is a Germanic language, first of all. And so if I read this out loud, and I will in a second, you're going to hear it's going to sound more German than it sounds English. But English is actually derived from German. It's related to German and Norwegian and Finnish and several other languages that are all up in the kind of the northern part of Europe. But it's alphabet, you know, with several of these letters, like this particular little weird letter, and you notice it's repeated several times, and then this letter, and there's another one that actually looks like a round, it looks like a big O with a mark in the middle of it. And that's also, and even this kind of AE blend together. And it's used several times, but these letters were part of Old English. They were part of Old German. And yet when in 1066, William the Conqueror from Normandy, a section of Spain, of France, crossed the English Channel, attacked and fought Harold II of England and beat him. He actually killed Harold II on the battlefield and took over for about 300 years, took over Great Britain. And so, and William the Conqueror, of course, was French. And so what did he speak? He spoke French. The court spoke French. They brought in a lot more priests and things like that. They were very religious. So so Latin was used a lot, and the only two languages for about 350 years in England that were written down were French and Latin. And so when we finally, in fact, they forbade the use of English, and English could have very well died. But fortunately, it already had a written form of itself, which is, you can see here. But eventually it would resurge back, you know, once the English kings became really English again. We were able to speak and write, and everything the court went back to speaking English. And yet the alphabet that we used was the Latin alphabet, because French comes from Latin too. French, Spanish, most of the languages we study, like Italian, French, Spanish, those are all Latinate languages. Portuguese they all descend from Latin. And so everything, essentially, it's changed our spelling. We had what was called the Great Vowel Shift. So a lot of vowels changed the way that they were pronounced. And then a lot of letters changed too. And so That's why it looks so different. But the AE sound is just an A sound. And the G's are usually pronounced with a Y sound, yeah, but then inside they're a G sound, the G sound. And so if I were to read this out loud, it's going to sound even weirder than it looks. Okay, so you say what, and that's actually what. That's what that means. It's just we switched around the H and W. So today it's WHAT. And yet that's what, we, and that's we. That actually means what it says. So pronouns actually stay quite a bit the same. So we gardena en jere dagum, theod koninge. Theod is like kind of like God. And then koninge is king. Trim jefrunan, Ku hatha athelingus elin fremeden, oft shield chefing shathena threatum, moniga magthum, meodosetla oftea, exoda eorlas. Sithan eres werth, fas shaft fundan, he thas frofrige bad weox under wolfnum, werthmundum tha, othat him ach wilke, para incitendra offer honrade, hieren shoulder gomben gildan. That was a God's tuning. Now that last sentence, obviously there are some words that I'd be able to pick out. But this last sentence is actually a sentence we would recognize. That was a good king. And of course, we can recognize other words. The more you read it, and this is what I found as I was going through, because what we did is we read all of Beowulf in Old English in my class, and then we translated it into, modern English ourselves. We got to make our own version of it. But the truth is there's like offer is over. And so a lot of the smaller words like oft is often, and tha is just those or these or that, they, the, or even the word just the. But a lot of these are not that, even should is just should. They took out the C and they put an OU, and it's pretty much the same. So there's a lot. I mean, if you're really into spelling, this is not a good thing for, it freaks people out. And I like spelling, so it's a little hard. But the truth is once you read it out loud, if you get used to it and you start to get used to the language, then you go, oh, okay, that's like folke is folk, people. And then it says, thon God send, then God sended or sent people. And so you see, so there's a lot that you could translate if you just hang out and do all of that. And so it takes a little bit, but it's not as weird as you think it is, I guess. Now, one thing too that to remember with this, and I'm going to skip back to the other Beowulf so you guys don't get confused any more than you have to be. One thing that you have to understand too is the vast majority of the population, even though there was a written form of English, Old English, there were very few people who read it and wrote it. Most people were illiterate. Most people in Rome were illiterate. Pretty much all women throughout the medieval period, very few women could write. There are a few exceptions, but unless you were royalty or, very, very much upper class, and your parents thought it was important for women to have an education, women couldn't read at all. But at the same time, really, even the upper class people, they very often would sign their name with an X. They couldn't read. And so if the only way you would have been educated is if you went to like a monastery, or, it's usually a religious institution. There were several monasteries that were set up as schools, and the wealthy people would send their kids over, almost all boys. Women, the only exception for women that would allow you to be literate is if you became a nun. So if you went in, to a convent, and, some of the upper class women might learn to read or write or something like that. in a convent, they'd be taught by nuns. Nuns would be taught to read and write, most of them. And then, or at least many of them. And then some women, some nuns were even scribes. So they would copy down books and things like that. But at this time, there was no printing press. So everything would have been written down by hand on vellum or parchment. And it would, I mean, books were painstakingly written. It could take them, one person, it might take them several weeks to a month to copy Beowulf down. And Beowulf itself, for many, many hundreds of years before it was written down, kind of like the Iliad and the Odyssey and other epics in the past, the Aeneid, those were going to be written, they were passed down orally by poets. Poets would memorize them. Many poets couldn't read. They would memorize them auditorily. They'd memorize them from what another poet spoke, and they'd commit them to memory, and then they'd chant them by memory for hundreds of years. I mean, they passed along the poems orally. And so the person who finally wrote these down was probably a religious scribe. And yet he wrote it in the original Old English. We think it was probably it is likely that the story itself originated somewhere in the mid first millennium, so like 500 to 600 or 700 CE. So in the Common Era, AD is another version of that. And then it probably wasn't written down until 1000, probably around the time of the Battle of Hastings. So 1066, somewhere, 100 years before, 100 years or 50 years or so after. But it was written in Old English. It was written in the original alphabet. But there were only a handful of copies. And so, unfortunately, we would have had a whole lot more copies, except later on when we get to the Renaissance, which we won't quite get to. The King of England, Henry VIII, decided that the libraries belonged to him. He switched over from Catholicism to, essentially, he created the Anglican Church, the Church of England, and he took a lot of the libraries over, and he destroyed a lot of the libraries. And that includes a lot of texts like this. So we only have a couple of mostly intact copies at this point of this text. But they were written down more than likely by religious scribes. So are there going to be some changes that they made? Are they going to add some things? Yeah, probably. And I'll point a few things out because of that. But this was a story. I mean, and one thing that's important about Beowulf is it really gives us a glimpse into what it was like to live in a pretty, either semi-nomadic or nomadic tribe among the Germanic tribes. So this was probably the closest we have in modern reference is to think about like Scottish clans, where family's everything, and you live with your clan, and you have a castle, and you have a clan lord or laird who kind of has dominion over the rest of the clan and makes a lot of the big decisions and stuff like that, but also protects. The warriors get together and they protect the clan, and just like they would protect the castle or something, the laird's castle. Well, Germanic tribes really didn't have castles. They come later. They come, with William the Conqueror. That's when the castle building takes on the version that we see today, with stone and concrete and things like that. That still last up until today. But this was essentially a tribal loyalty. So you have somebody who's in charge. In this case, like with the Danes, it's Hrothgar, and he's the king of the Danes, and so he's in charge. But then he has all of these warriors under him, and they protect Daneland from other tribes. And so it's a very much a warrior culture, and the tribal loyalty is really important, and tribal, the warriors really are important, because if they don't protect the clan's going to die. And so the tribe itself is dependent upon the warriors being able to protect the people in it. And you also have to have utter loyalty to your king or lord, because he's going to make the decisions, but you're the ones, the warriors are the ones who uphold those decisions. If the lord is weak or the warriors are weak, the tribe won't survive. And that's kind of where we get this is kind of like the sort of early version of feudalism. and feudalism is a more structured version of it, but it's essentially where the king is served by his lords, and the king, doesn't really own the land, but he is kind of oversees all the little lairdships, the little castle areas that are protected by individual lords. In exchange for the loyalty of the lords have that land to rule. And then underneath the lords are vassals or knights who serve the Lord. And the Lord gives them plots of land for their loyalty, but then their job is to be warriors, to protect that area for the Lord. And then underneath the knights, he has all these serfs that, actually plant the land and work the land and grow crops and do other services and stuff like that. And then they get to live on the land in exchange. And so, but then the Lord and his warriors, his vassals, protect all of the people. And so that's just kind of the way it is. It's all top down. But obviously the king's the richest person, the lords are next is rich, then the vassals are next is rich. But those three groups are really the top 10% of the population. The vast majority of the population is poor, and they can't do warrior stuff and everything. In this case, though, we're mostly dealing with warriors. So we have the king, and then we have these warriors that serve him. Of course, now it's a little bit different, and this is what's unusual about Beowulf is that Beowulf is not a Dane. So he is. When we talk about the Spear Danes, this is the Danes they're talking about with Hrothgar, and they kind of do a little bit of hierarchy, like this is what, it started with Shield Chafing or Chafson, and that just means he's Shield son of Shafe. And everybody was delineated by who their father was. Kind of like in the Iliad, where it was, the son of Peleus and the son of, son of Atreus, the sons of Atreus. And so knowing the lineage was kind of part of knowing who everybody was. But essentially they're talking about, it talks about Shield, and he was son of Shafe. And then we still, we have last names that come from that. We still have like Davidson, Erickson. Those are all descendants of these Germanic tribes, and that's how they were named. So, I would actually be in the traditional way. I'd be Cheryl Frankson, because even though I'm a daughter, I'm a kid of my dad, and my dad's name is Frank. And so it would be, that's kind of how they would do it. Now we have surnames. And so, your kids would have your last name. And then, if your daughter got married, then she would take her husband's name very often. And then their kids would have his last name. But they didn't do that back then. So we start with Shield, and he essentially, he was really good. He seized mead benches from any man. So he actually conquered a lot of stuff. Okay. And he was a foundling. He was rescued, but then he grew, and then he was really famous, and and he was a fine king. So remember when I said that was good kuning, that's right there. That was a fine king. And then he had a kid, and essentially and his name was Beo, which is really bear, is probably what it's most related to, the word was. And he was really famous, and he was heir, essentially he inherited the lands. Okay. And then it essentially goes through all of this. Then Shield passed, and they kept on going, and so essentially they finally give, where is it? They talk about the fact that Bayo got all this treasure and stuff like that. And then, but that's just, it's almost any, if nothing else, it's just saying that there was a long line of kings, and they were all famous and great and stuff like that. So then Bayo the Shielding, again, it's still Bayo. He got really old, and then his father departed, that Shield. And then his heir, the great Halfdane, da 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 ruled the Bright Shieldings after his lifetime. And then they had a bunch of people, and to him were born four in succession: Herielgar, Hrothgar, Helga, and Ursa. And of course, Hrothgar is the one who inherits. So he's the king of the Danes now. Okay. And he was pretty good king. So now that they're all settled, they don't have to go to war. They don't have a lot of more battles and stuff. And he has a bunch of warriors. He builds, so his mind turned to house building. And he made and built himself a massive mead hall. Now, Iverson, do you know what mead is?
No.
No? Okay. Mead is fermented honey. And so there's actually, if you go to northern Georgia, believe it or not, they have several, they have, it's kind of wine country up in northern Georgia, but they have meaderies as well. And all they're just, if you have a good supply, you have honeybees and you have a good supply of honey, you can make mead. This was a very traditional drink. You don't drink the water back then because you're going to get really ill. And so people pretty much just drank fermented beverages. So I mean, there such a thing as ale? Yes, but in this area, it was far easier to make mead. And so because it was just fermented honey. It tastes, I guess, it kind of like a little dryish white wine. It's not super dry, but it's got a sweetness to it, probably because of, the um, honey. But essentially a mead hall is just like a big dining hall, and it's like in a castle keep or something. You think about it, but at this point there were no castles yet. They didn't have stone castles, so any fortifications would have been made of wood. And the mead hall was a place where everybody in the whole clan, the whole tribe, could come in and eat and drink mead and share stories. And the king would sit there and he'd you know kind of rule over all of his followers, but we'd all eat together. So we don't really do that. I mean, we do have a student union, like a student center here on campus where people can all get together and eat, but it's not the same thing. It's kind of like a cafeteria. It's you come in and you get fed food and you drink a lot of mead, and then a lot of times, especially the men, would fall asleep right where they were. They just like lay down on the rushes on the hay on the floor and go to sleep. And so that was pretty normal, I guess, for an evening. And then if you were upper class, like the King Hrothgar and his wife and stuff, they'd have their own rooms, and they'd go to their private chambers and they'd have privacy. But the rest of the people, they just sleep around on the floor or in little cots or something like that. They might make some little beds, but they'd be kind of all together out in public in the mead hall, and they'd spend the night and then they'd go home the next day or something. So that was kind of so he built one of these places so they could have partying. They could literally have a good time and feast together and share, essentially ideas and good poetry and, epic poems like this one, whatever. So they build the hall. Soon it came to pass, out of men's hands, it stood complete. Ta-da! So they took them a while for many craftsmen to build it, but then they did it, and they called it Harrod. And it was really awesome because then they got to go in there. The hall was beautiful. It had high ceilings, and everybody was friendly. They all had a good time. But because they were in there partying, and because they went in, were feasting and having a good time, okay, then it woke up something else. Okay. So it even says, nor was it long till sharp-edged malice between in-laws, born of their enmity, awakened. And it was then a bold monster, fretted its time away, dweller in darkness, that every day heard din of revels loud in the hall. So the noise of the revelry in the mead hall wakes up Grendel, and he doesn't like it. He doesn't like friendliness. He doesn't like happiness because he's all sharp-edged malice. He's angry. And he doesn't like it. He doesn't even like he could hear the harp's note and the song of poets. So they're all telling stories. And in fact, they're telling stories about God making the earth. And so they're telling Bible stories, which is unlikely for the early Germanic tribes because they were pagan. But then later on, of course, these are scribes. So the scribes are like, what would wake Grendel up? Well, if they're telling all these stories, these Christian stories about God, well, that would wake up Grendel because he's like he's not he's not like a demon or anything. They actually describe him as the spawn of Cain. So he is they call him Cain's kin. So Cain killed Abel in the biblical stories, and then he was banished. He essentially said, well, it's not my job to take care of Abel. And then of course it came out that he'd killed him, and he was banished, and supposedly he was given a mark to denote, don't kill him, essentially to, don't kill this person who's been exiled, but it's that mark, what does it mean? And to them, it's like it changed him. He's not quite human or something. And so the spawn of Cain are monsters. And that's kind of where we're going with this particular thing. That's what the scribe probably this was an element that the scribe added, because the scribe was, of course, a Christian scribe. And so he's making this much more about, it's not a pagan group, it's a Christian group, the Danes. So anyway, this creature is upset by the stories that are being told in the hall, upset by the noise. He doesn't like that it's so loud. And so he doesn't, they love the stories. The Danes are all enjoying it. They're all happy. And they're doing well. They're successful. The hall is beautiful. Everybody's having a good time. But then comes Grendel, and he's the one who's going to end the happiness. So this grim demon was named Grendel, a marsh stalker. So he wanders out in the woods. I always, and I can't help it, but I always envision him sort of as like a Sasquatch, where he's humanish, but he's not a human being, but he's maybe covered with hair and big and strong and bigger than an ordinary person, and creepy, and obviously he has a taste for people because that's what he does. So anyway, he wanders normally through the moors. The wretch ruled over exiled monsters for a while, but then it says essentially he was one of Cain's kin, and so he was banned. That's why he was banished, and he became sort of non-human. And Cain, and it just, of course, reminds us, he didn't, he had a feud with his brother, but that ended up driving him away from the rest of mankind. Okay. And then it says unspeakable things awoke, ogres and elves, imps of Orcus, the giants. And these are all related to Grendel. Yeah, you might have read some of this in high school. It's highly possible. Usually when they do it in high school though, you only read the part with Grendel. So that's what we're reading this, like you read the first half, and it's going to be probably made smaller, like massively edited and abridged. Because it is, I mean, it's actually not as long as you first think, but yeah, you probably read. I know that I read all of it, but I was in an advanced class, but then they also read another one where I just read the battle with Grendel. There's actually a book too called Grendel, and it was written by an American author, and it's from his point of view. So it tells the same story, but it only of the first half of the book, but it tells it from the monster. You get an understanding of why the monster attacked the people and what the monster was really, and you kind of feel bad for the monster. And then it ends sadly, though, of course, because that's how Grendel's life ends sadly. So anyway, so Grendel's woken. He doesn't like the fact that they're partying. He doesn't like the noise they're making. He doesn't like the stories they're telling because they're, about God. And he's angry with God because of his ancestor, Cain, who was banished because of what he'd done. So Grendel comes to the hall in the middle of the night. Everybody's been drinking, so they're all sleeping on the floor. At least all the warriors are, you know. And so Grendel at nightfall set out to see, essentially he wants to investigate the mead hall. And there he found a noble host sleeping from feasting, dead to woe and human sorrow. So they had drunken themselves into a stupor. And was that pretty common? Yeah, it was pretty common for them to party and then be pretty drinky. I don't know how people drank that much, but I don't know. I guess they did. So they're all sleeping and they're in that kind of drunken stupor. So the cursed beast, grim and greedy, ruthless and ripe. And these, it's funny because this translation really does pick up on some of the Old English original because they loved alliteration. They loved to repeat those sounds. So grim and greedy, ruthless and ripe. They would, and even soon, you know, for savagery, soon snatched, they absolutely would have used all of these kinds of noises. They loved the repetition of sounds. It also makes it easier for a poet to learn the words and commit them to memory. So that's actually a really, those are common elements within Old English poetry anyway. But he comes in and had soon snatched 30 thanes from their slumber. So literally he picked up and ate 30 people, swallowed up. And then he left, sated with spoils, with a feast of flesh to seek his lair. And right there in the half light before dawn, Brenda, so in the morning when the sun's just about to come up, people wake up and they go, oh, wait a second. There's blood everywhere and people are gone and dead. And he is just like, what the heck? You know, here we have this nice party place. And you know, imagine, okay, so you have this big feast, you all go to sleep and you wake up in the morning and 30 people are gone. And there's blood. It's obvious that something came and ate them in the middle of the night. And right next to them are other people sleeping. Like he ate a bunch of people, but he left a bunch of other people there. And so the king's distressed, and they stare at the demon's foul trail, its strong poison lasting and lingering. So he's poisonous too. And yes. So, well, no, what happens is, okay, so every night Grendel comes so that, you know, they said, nor had they long to wait for more. So in a few nights later, Grendel again dealt more murder without remorse. His fate and fury held too fast to him. So he was just so angry, he came in and ate more people. And essentially, it says, easy to find him who'd be elsewhere, seeking his slumber further away, a bed among. So he starts to attack everywhere. But if you're in the hall, you're going to be dead. And so people start avoiding the hall and locking themselves up somewhere else because they don't want to be attacked. And so after a while, nobody wants to eat in the hall. Nobody wants to drink in the hall. Nobody wants to party in the hall. They don't want to do anything in the hall because somebody's going to die. And so Grendel ruled, defying the right, one against all, till the finest houses stood deserted. So people don't want to be near the hall. People started moving away because they're scared to death he's going to attack them because he could get into anything. He can break into any wherever's. And so 12 winters tide, that's 12 years. That is a long, so 12 winters later, a long time, they suffer like this. That's a long time for a hall to be unused. So it was known to the sons of men, sung clearly in bitter ballads, that Grendel wrought long against Hrothgar. So out for 12 years, they're being bombarded by these attacks from Grendel, and they can't do anything. The warriors can't fight him. They can't stop him. More warriors get killed. It's just bad. And so then far and wide, you know, the bards, the singers who spread stories and bring news, they start telling the tales of for Daneland and Hrothgar, who's being attacked by this monster, okay? And they can't make peace with the creature, they can't fix it, they can't stop him, and the warriors can't seem to fight him off. Like, if the warriors wait in the hall, they're going to get killed. And he's going to find it, even if they're hiding somewhere near, he's going to find them and kill them and eat them. And so people they're scared to death to be outside after dark. They're scared to death. They need to be locked up far away, and they never know when he's going to attack. I mean, it's horrible, absolutely horrible. And they even say he haunted Herod at night, in the dark of night, preventing from anyone from nearing the gift throne. So the king's, of course, not waiting in there. But this means, okay, so they built this beautiful place and they can't use it. And they're in constant terror that he's going to attack again. Okay. So oftentimes they made sacred vows to pagan shrines, because remember, they are pagan. They offer up a prayer that some demon slayer would grant aid to the people. So they want a hero to come and fix this problem. Now, what's interesting, though, is that Hrothgar has warriors, but the warriors aren't fixing the problem. That's their job, to protect the hall, to protect the king, to protect the people of Daneland, and they can't get it done. And that's a problem. What's going to happen in the long run is eventually Hrothgar is going to get killed by the monster himself, and so the monster is going to kill everyone. They're all going to be dead. Okay. So they're without hope. They're hopeless. Nothing ever is going to happen. They're in trouble, and they've been through this for 12 years now. Okay. But because of that, because it's been so long and word has spread, while Halfdane, that's Hrothgar's, while he broods and waits for someone to save him, another person comes, and among the gates, and it looks like Geats, but it's Gates. That's how it's pronounced. But he's a thane. That's like a vassal or a knight. Okay, a thane. But he serves the king Higelac. And if you call him Higelac, that's okay. But it's Higelac. That's where the G is a y-ish sound. So Higelac is his king of in Gateland. So he's not a Dane. He's a different tribe, but he hears about the stories. So Beowulf, who's really, it's like, it's either Beowulf or Beowulf, but I think it's Beowulf. And knowing what I know about the Old English, I think it's almost like that's his name. Like, he's almost like werewolf, but he's more brawny, and the animal name actually goes with his brawny tendencies. He's just tougher, stronger, bigger, more muscular, more capable than any other guy. So he serves Higelac. He hears about Grendel, and he goes, hey, I want to go and save the Danes by conquering the monster. And so but he can't do that without his king saying, yeah, I'll let you. Essentially, he's lending him and his some other Gate warriors to the Danes to solve a problem. But this is rare. This does not normally happen. It's extremely rare for people in one tribe to help out people in another tribe, especially if there's not an actual alliance between them. They're not connected by marriage or something. And so, but Beowulf just really wants to prove himself against this Grendel guy. And so he asks Hugelac, and the king says, he essentially wants to go, and the king allows it to happen. So he gets some people together, and he essentially wants to go help Hrothgar. And they say, yay, okay. So a bunch of people follow him. They're his people, and they go with him. And he chooses from among the gates the bravest he could find, okay, and takes 15 with him. Well, no, 14 with him, because he's the 15th. And they sail across the water to Daneland, to maybe it's Denmark, I don't know exactly, but it's wherever that tribe of Danes were living at the time. And they take the ship, they go across the waves, and they want to, it's like the challenge. I don't know. It's one of those, they're going to go prove themselves against the the monster. Okay, then they get across, they left ashore, and then they go up. And it's funny because these are warlike groups, so they're going to be accosted. They're not going to just walk in and go, "Hey, I'm going to help." Instead, they have a sentry who says, "Who are you?" And he wants to protect Daneland from these outside warriors. He doesn't know what they're there for because they could be attacking. I mean, the truth is it's possible. But the lookouts, from their walls, from Herod, from the Daneland's kind of like um, fortifications, they see Beowulf in his boat and all the people arriving, and they're all armed, and so of course that can be a threat. But essentially, he sees the shields, he sees that they're arms, and he needs to know who they are and why they're here. And so he rides down to the shore, and he kind of brandishes his own spear and says, "Who are you? And why are you coming here all armed?" Okay, because that's not necessarily a good thing. So if you're an enemy, I have to, we're going to stop right there. And he even says, "Never so openly have men arrived armed like this, without passwords, without permission to come." And so he says, then he also says, so I've never seen anybody just show up on our land without permission. But he also says, never have I seen a mightier lord of this earth, warrior in war gear. And he even says, you are no vassal. In other words, he sees him as even higher than a knight. He's like a thane, all of those words that we use for the person who serves the laird. He goes, no, you're more noble than that. So he recognizes him because of his brawniness or whatever as a king. Like you're better than a regular knight. You're more than that. You are no vassal, ennobled in battle. But I need to know, where do you come from? Who are you? And I can't let you go see the Danes until I know it. Okay. And so Beowulf answers. He unlocked his word hoard. This is so common, the way that that's described in Old English. And he says, we're Gates and we're hearth brothers to Higelac, the king. And my father was Ecgtheow, and he was a warrior in chief. And then he died, but he died in old age. And now I just serve Higelac. And we came, and then he tells him right out, I came because I heard about, I'm seeking your king because I heard that he was in trouble and we're coming to help him. And there's no reason for me to sneak in because I'm coming in openly to help you guys. And so what we've heard, this is the story we've heard, is that there's a monster, a hidden despoiler, an unknown enemy in the dark of night who comes in and kills people. And I can offer either advice on how to defeat Grendel, or I can fight him myself. I can actually, help him so that he doesn't have to, he can either take my advice or he can keep on suffering. That's what he says. And the watchman's like, wow. Now you say this is what you're doing. You said this troop is, and he goes, we're loyal to the Shieldings, to Hrothgar, and you seem to be loyal to. I'll guide you in, and I will order my comrades to guard your ship against enemies. Because remember, any other tribe could come by, take their ship, or set it on fire or do whatever. So I'll protect that too. So we'll protect your ship while you help us with our stuff. And so very quickly, he's led over to Daneland itself, actually allowed in. Now, they're all following, and they see the hall of Herod, that where all the bad stuff started, and it's beautiful. Of course, they describe that again, how glorious it is and everything. And then the warrior says, I gotta go. I'm gonna go tell the king, but and then I'm gonna go watch for more people because he's the watchman. He has to go back to where he was supposed to be. And so they all come in and they're all, of course, still armed. But then they come in, they're tired of being at sea, but they stack their hard-rimmed broad shields against the walls. They drop to the benches, armor clashing. So it's I mean, honestly, in Old English, it sounds so cool because Old English has that kind of roughness to it. Especially the fight with Grendel it sounds awesome the way it's narrated. But they come in, they're all still clad in armor and everything. But then a proud and noble warrior asked the heroes. So one of the Dane warriors asked them, "Why are you coming in all armed?" And he says, "I'm Hrothgar's officer and herald, and I've never seen such a host of brave-looking strangers." So again, they get compliments. Wow, you guys look pretty awesome. And he says, "I assume you want to talk to the king, not as exiles, but of heart. In other words, you don't look like vagabonds, like you've been exiled from your own group and you're looking for help. You look like you're well fed and it looks like you're coming to help us instead," which is true. It's actually what it is true. And so Beowulf introduces himself again, and he says he does want to talk to the king. And and then Wolfgar, he was the one who had stopped it, had talked to them the first time. He says, "Okay, well, let me go and ask." And it doesn't take long. Um, Hrothgar is old and gray, so he's an old king at that time. Well, it's funny because that's a great question, Iverson. Did they have monsters? Well, they did have heroes, but even in the Greek, like in Greek mythology, there were a lot of monsters. Um, in Old English mythology and in Old German, in the Germanic tribes, many of these populations believed in sea creatures, not just like sirens or mermaids, but like actual like sea dragons. They absolutely believed in dragons. So like a volcano that was, blowing, that was a dragon inside the mountain. That was pretty typical belief. They believed in fairies and ogres and all sorts of other magical creatures. It's funny because um, when we get to Smaug, well, no, when we get to the dragon next week, well, you're probably reading it for this week, but when we talk about the dragon next week, if you've read The Hobbit or you've read The Lord of the Rings or seen the movies, it's probably going to remind you a lot of that. But J.R.R. Tolkien, the guy who wrote the Lord of the Rings series and wrote The Hobbit, was actually a medieval professor. So he studied all this kind of literature. And so it makes sense that he kind of drew from it. But there was a time too, I mean, and even in populations, even in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, there are still people today who believe in fairies and who believe it. They have all sorts of different names, but little magical creatures who do things and pixies and stuff like that. But there's definitely this whole magic world that is part of the culture back then, and so they're just drawing on that. So it's one thing to have a person be a hero, in an epic poem who fights other people. It's a total other thing, and that's what's going on in Beowulf, where he's not fighting people, he's fighting monsters. So he fights this monster, and then he fights Grendel's mom, who's we assume looks just like her, only she's meaner. And then he fights in the very end, the last battle that he does in this epic poem is he fights a dragon. And he has to do so by himself because his warriors are too scared to fight, and he kind of tells them to just stay back and he'll do it. Even though he's old, but he's reigned as king for 50 years at that point. So he's very old, and yet he fights the dragon. But if he fights just regular people, that's not. It's kind of like in the Iliad. You remember when Achilles would fight, but he Apollo would be helping the other person, or the gods were kind of interfering, and that so they'd make things harder or easier or stuff like that. Well, that's kind of what's going on here, where they're making it more of a battle by putting in magic elements to it. So it's not that he's just fighting something that's equal to him. He's fighting something that's a big monster that eats people. And so it adds to the stakes and makes him more heroic. If that does that make sense, Iverson? Hopefully that does. But yes, I mean, many people back then believed in real monsters. Like they wouldn't go swimming. Even sailors, even in the 17th, 18th century, they'd be at sea all their lives. They couldn't swim. And they were deathly afraid of the water because they thought the water was full of sea creatures. I mean, literally, they thought that they would be eaten by a sea serpent if they fell in the water. And so it's fascinating how much they believed in. I mean, mostly if you look at the ocean, though, I mean, it's huge and it's dark and it's deep and goodness knows what's swimming in there. That's probably what they were thinking. Well, they didn't have any means to really study. They couldn't send little submarines down to kind of look at the life down there and see that whether there was a giant squid or sea dragons or anything like that. So it's all by their imagination. Yeah, Beowulf is, well, and it's funny because they're both epic poems. So they're poems about these really big saga of a story. They're about heroes. They were passed along for hundreds of years orally before they were ever written down. And the warriors that they describe are somewhat different. And so they have different ideas about our role in the world, who people are and how they relate to magical creatures and other stuff. They also have different things to say about what it means to be a warrior, to what it means to be a hero. So Achilles, can have tremendous anger and even sit out of a war, and yet he's still heroic because of the deeds he can do when he gets back in the war. He just fights better than anybody else. But he also has ties to gods. His mom is a goddess, and he's impervious to weaponry except for his ankle, his Achilles heel. And so there are mystical elements about who he is that make him above the norm, better than the average warrior. But it's his bravery, and it's also his obedience to the gods, his willingness to be merciful um, when Priam comes to get his son Hector to get the body, and he allows him to take the body and also make sure he gets out of the camp safely. So there are aspects to who a person is, what makes up their character to make them into a hero, and what makes a person not a hero. Agamemnon is not a hero. He may be okay in battle, but he's a jerk, and he doesn't obey the gods, and he does things that go against rules of hospitality. And he would have killed Priam had he found him in camp. He wouldn't have listened to the gods if they told him not to. And so there's a lot that goes into who, being a hero. For Beowulf, though, and this type of heroism, so much of it is bound in loyalty, but it's loyalty to his king and to other, in this case to Hrothgar. I'm going to do what I can, even if it kills me. I'm going to do what I can to fight this war, this monster, so that your people will be safe. And so that essentially the fact that he's willing to offer up his life and risk his life to fight this battle off of his own, not for his own clan, but for another tribe, that says something about how Beowulf is extra special, because he has extra courage. He has extra abilities. So he's a loyal. He wouldn't have gone if his king had told him don't go, he wouldn't have gone. But he was allowed to go. But what did it do? It's going to win him treasure. He's going to get a reward. In the same way, remember, Achilles got treasure and he got a reward for fighting, and he got a reward for giving up, he got payment for giving up Hector's body. So there's a lot of money that exchanges hands too. That's what's going to happen. So Beowulf essentially is once he wins, Hrothar's going to give him tons of treasure, and he's going to take that treasure and he's going to take it back to his king, Higelac. And then his king will distribute it. Beowulf will probably get a lion's share of it because he's the bravest and he's the one who really killed Grendel. But he's still going to he's going to bring it to his king first out of loyalty. So this is really where we get to ideas about fealty. And I guess I can put that, let me put that in the chat. Not that one. Let me see. And it's just fealty. It's like loyalty, but it's loyalty to almost like a contractual loyalty. But yes, there are definite similarities between the Iliad and Beowulf, and the Odyssey and Beowulf, and there are other epic. I mean, the Aeneid is the same type of thing, but for the Trojan survivor Aeneas, who founds Rome, and so he has an epic poem of his own, and even the very earliest epic poem that we have is Gilgamesh, and that was written in Sanskrit, and it's ancient Indian, but it's also about this man Gilgamesh who performs these great deeds and is super strong and everything else. So, and there are actually other sagas besides Beowulf. There's I guess I'll put that in the chat too. There are several Finnish and Norwegian sagas. There's one, and it's Grettir. It's really Grettir's saga, but they didn't that it if you look at the actual title, it's always entitled Grettis Saga, because they didn't have apostrophes and possessives like that. So, but it's about a man named Grettir who's super strong and has a major anger management problem, but he also goes through and fights battles and stuff like that. Okay, so we don't know exactly. We think that for the most part, well, we don't know. The truth is we don't know. So that's a great question, Iverson. Is it, is it before the Common Era or after the Common Era? We don't know. Because these were passed along orally for centuries. We know that, for instance, Gilgamesh is many thousands of years old. So it was written well before the Common Era. Probably the estimates are somewhere between 2500, 3200 BC. So that's very old. But then the Iliad and the Odyssey were probably written at least 1000 BCE, but they were passed down for hundreds and hundreds of years before then. So how old they actually are, we just don't know. When did they originate? Who originally wrote them? We have no idea, and we'll never know. And the same thing goes for Grettir's saga and goes for Beowulf. These were passed down. I mean, for all we know, they could predate the Common Era. They could have been written, I mean, originally created, orally and passed along orally well before, 1 CE, or before we get into AD at all. They absolutely we know the stories predate Christian ideas, that they started long before Christianity moved north into Europe from the Roman Empire. So we just don't know by how many hundreds of years. So when was it actually written? We have no idea. When was it written down? We only can guesstimate. It's somewhere between, and it really depends on who you ask. It's somewhere between 850 CE and 1150 CE. But we just don't know. We don't know when it was written down. And then we know that it was way, way before then, that it was probably created and added to over the years and became as long as it did and stuff like that. So and it may be that it started with one story just of Grendel, and then maybe another poet added the Grendel's mom in there for added action. We just don't know. And because even today we only have like 2 or 3 versions of this copy. And most of them there are even some places where the pages are illegible. And so much of it is guesswork about, there are just passages that we miss. And so because we don't have, if we had a bunch of copies, we could kind of compare them all and use carbon dating and think, but We just don't know. We don't know. Unfortunately, there's so much we don't know about it. I'm just grateful we have it, because had the 2 copies that kind of survived been destroyed as well, then no one would know anything about Beowulf. So, but yeah, it's old, but we just don't know how old, if that answers your question. So, and we are out of time. So I'll get to the actual battle next time. We'll talk about the other warrior under Hrothgar who kind of challenges Beowulf, and then we'll look at the actual battle between Beowulf and Grendel next time. So, but thanks for your questions, Iverson. They were wonderful today. And those of you who are watching the recording, if you do have questions after you watch the recordings, please email me. Don't feel like I've answered everything that I could answer. And if you do have questions, and especially if it's a question that I think would benefit everyone, I will answer everyone. I'll tell everybody, somebody asked about this, and then here's the answer. So do you have any other questions, Iverson? I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, and then you can ask if you have a question.